I think the sooner they go, literally leave the country, the better it will be.
At Sandringham, the night had gone completely still. No wind moved through the frost-covered grounds. No lights burned in the staff quarters. Even the estate's ancient oak trees stood motionless against the dark sky, as though the land itself was holding its breath. But inside the private residential wing, behind a door that had been quietly locked from the inside, King Charles was not sleeping. He was sitting at his desk, and he was reading. The documents before him were not ceremonial. They were not the kind of paperwork that arrives with pomp and protocol and the measured rhythm of royal administration. These were different, dense, financial, precise to a degree that made every line feel like a blade pressed quietly against the institution he had spent his entire life protecting. Outside, the clock had already crossed midnight. The estate was silent. The household staff had been dismissed hours earlier with unusual haste, their departures arranged quietly, without explanation. Insiders would later describe the atmosphere that night as controlled and deliberate, as though someone had carefully emptied the rooms before a conversation that could never be overheard. And in the middle of that silence, Princess Anne arrived. She did not knock loudly. She did not come with an entourage or a scheduled briefing or any of the formal language that usually surrounds royal communication of this magnitude. She came alone. She came carrying a dossier. And according to those who would later piece together the events of that evening, she came with the specific, devastating intention of stopping something that was already minutes away from becoming permanent. What she placed on the king's desk changed everything. The dossier was not thin. It was not a single sheet of concern or a loosely worded warning from a worried sibling. It was thorough, documented, built over weeks of quiet, methodical investigation into financial records that most inside the palace had never thought to question. And as Charles read through what his sister had assembled, the color reportedly drained from his expression in a way that those close to him had only seen once or twice before in moments of genuine constitutional crisis. He read it once. Then he read it again. And then, without summoning advisors, without placing a call, without the lengthy deliberation that normally precedes any significant royal decision, King Charles reached for his pen. Hi viewers, here is a question that has been burning through royal circles since that night at Sandringham. Whose side are you on? Do you believe Princess Anne did the right thing by going directly to the king? Or should she have confronted Camilla first? Drop your answer in the comments right now. What he signed in those silent minutes was not a routine estate directive. It was not a bureaucratic adjustment dressed in legal language. According to palace insiders, it was a classified counterorder, one that formally stripped away everything Camilla had spent months quietly building toward and transferred absolute administrative oversight of the Sandringham estate directly into Princess Anne's hands. Irreversibly, completely, with the full weight of royal authority pressed behind every word. By the time dawn broke over the Norfolk countryside, the order had already been sealed and moved under the kind of security protocol usually reserved for matters touching the very foundation of the crown. No press release followed. No carefully worded palace statement arrived to soften the edges. The silence that greeted the morning was not accidental. It was a message. Something had been decided. Something had been destroyed. And somewhere inside Sandringham, Queen Camilla was about to discover that the plan she had protected so carefully, the arrangement she had constructed so quietly over months of calculated patience, had been dismantled in the space of a single night. Not by an enemy, not by the press, not by a constitutional challenge from Parliament or a public scandal she could have anticipated and managed. It had been taken apart by a woman who had watched her for a very long time. A woman who never showed her hand until the moment it was impossible to recover from. The blow had been delivered, and it had been final. But to understand why that night at Sandringham became one of the most explosive moments in recent royal history, it is necessary to go back further. Back to the months of silence that preceded it. Back to the quiet corridors and careful financial arrangements and the slow, patient maneuvering of a woman who had convinced herself that no one was paying close enough attention to notice what she was building. She was wrong about that. She had been wrong about that for a very long time. Camilla had always understood patience. She had learned it the hard way, across decades of public scrutiny, personal humiliation, and the kind of quiet endurance that most people never fully appreciate from the outside. She had waited for Charles when waiting seemed impossible. She had smiled through hostility. She had absorbed criticism that would have broken a less disciplined woman. And when the crown finally arrived, when the years of sacrifice and silence were rewarded with the title she had once thought permanently out of reach, something shifted inside her. Not visibly, not in any way the public could have pointed to and named. But those close to the palace would later whisper that the moment Camilla became queen, something that had always been carefully restrained in her began to move with far greater confidence. She stopped waiting. She started planning. The Sandringham estate had always been more than a country retreat. It stretches across nearly 20,000 acres of Norfolk countryside, a landscape of working farmland, managed forests, and significant agricultural enterprise generating revenues that run deep into the finances of the Crown's private holdings. It is not simply a house where the royal family spends Christmas. It is an asset, a historically protected, institutionally significant asset that has passed through royal hands for generations, carrying with it obligations that stretch far beyond personal preference or private arrangement. Camilla understood all of that. What insiders now allege is that she understood it and decided to work around it anyway. The plan, as palace sources would later piece together, had not materialized overnight. It had been constructed slowly, deliberately, across a period of several months. The mechanism was not crude. It was not a simple transfer or an obvious financial grab that any palace accountant might have flagged on routine review. It was far more sophisticated than that. According to those who would eventually examine the documentation, Camilla had been quietly maneuvering to redirect a portion of Sandringham's agricultural revenues, the income generated from the estate's working farms and commercial land operations, into a private family trust. A trust connected not to the crown, not to royal institutional oversight, but to her own family's private interests. Think about what that actually means. The revenues were not small. The arrangement, if finalized, would have created a private financial channel drawing directly from one of the most historically protected properties in the British royal portfolio, shielded from the transparency and accountability that crown assets are constitutionally expected to maintain. It would have been, in the language of those who later reviewed the documents, an extraordinary act of institutional redirection, dressed in legal language, hidden inside administrative paperwork, moving through channels that most people inside the palace never thought to look at twice. And it had been moving for months before anyone raised an alarm. That was the part that reportedly chilled palace insiders most deeply. Not the audacity of the plan itself, though that alone was staggering. It was the duration, the patience, the careful, incremental nature of the construction that suggested this had been thought through long before the first document was ever drafted. Camilla had not acted impulsively. She had acted like someone who believed she had identified the one corner of the royal institution where her position as queen gave her enough proximity to authority that questions would be slow to arrive. She was not entirely wrong about that. For months, the paperwork moved. Quietly, carefully, with the practiced invisibility of someone who understood that the safest way to move something significant was to make it look unremarkable. Palace sources allege that certain administrative approvals had already been secured, certain preliminary arrangements had already been set in motion, and the timeline was compressing toward a point of no return. A finalization date had reportedly been established. The paperwork was prepared. The structure was nearly complete. And then the dossier landed on the king's desk. Everything Camilla had built across those months, every careful layer of the arrangement, every document moved through quiet channels, every administrative approval she had gathered, was about to be examined by the one person inside the palace she had not fully accounted for. The one woman whose institutional loyalty ran so deep, whose knowledge of crown assets was so thorough, and whose tolerance for what she viewed as exploitation of royal holdings was so absolute that there was never going to be a version of this plan she simply allowed to pass. Princess and had been watching, and she had not been idle. It had started, by most accounts, with a number that did not match. Not a dramatic discovery. Not a sudden revelation that arrived with alarm bells and urgent briefings. It began the way most significant uncoverings begin inside institutions, with the kind of quiet patience they mistake for, with a small irregularity that most people would have noted, filed away, and eventually forgotten. A figure in a set of estate financial reports that sat slightly outside the expected range. Nothing that would have triggered formal concern on its own. Nothing that demanded immediate action. Just a number that did not quite belong, pressing quietly against Anne's attention in a way she could not fully dismiss. She did not dismiss it. That decision, to pursue rather than ignore, to pull rather than leave alone, was the moment that ultimately unraveled everything Camilla had constructed. Because Princess and approaching a financial irregularity is not the same as most people approaching one. She did not delegate the concern. She did not pass it to an advisor and wait for a summary. She went directly into the records herself, methodically, systematically, with the kind of focused institutional precision that had defined her royal work for decades, and had always been different from the others. Where some members of the royal family had adapted to modern royal life with varying degrees of comfort and controversy, and had remained constant, disciplined, unsentimentally devoted to the institution in a way that sometimes made her appear cold to those who did not understand what that devotion actually cost her. She had no patience for what she privately viewed as the blurring of lines between personal ambition and royal duty. She had seen enough of the monarchy's internal life to understand exactly how devastating it could be when those lines were crossed. And she had spent the better part of her royal career ensuring that when it mattered, she was the person who held the line. This time, holding the line meant building a case. Week by week, document by document, the picture assembled itself in front of her with a clarity that reportedly left little room for alternative interpretation. The agricultural revenue trails, the private trust structure, the administrative approvals that had moved through channels just obscure enough to avoid routine scrutiny, the timeline that pointed unmistakably toward a finalization date that was approaching faster than anyone outside a very small circle realized. And gathered it all. She cross-referenced. She verified. She reportedly consulted a small number of trusted financial and legal minds, people whose discretion she had tested over many years, to ensure that what she was seeing was exactly what it appeared to be. It was. And when the picture was complete, when the dossier was assembled with a precision that left no meaningful gap, and made a decision that would define that chapter of royal history, she did not go to the press. She did not raise the matter through official palace channels where the paperwork might have been quietly managed and the consequences softened into something more comfortable. She did not give Camilla the opportunity to be warned, to adjust, to find a way to reframe what had been built before anyone with real authority had seen it fully. She went directly to Charles. She walked into his private study at Sandringham with the dossier under her arm, and a composure that insiders would later describe as extraordinary given what she was carrying. She placed the documents in front of her brother without theatrical language, without lengthy preamble, without the emotional framing that might have allowed the king to process what he was seeing as anything other than what it was. She let the numbers speak. She let the paper trail do what it had been assembled to do. And then she waited. What Charles felt in those minutes is something no official account will ever fully capture. He was a husband. He had stood beside Camilla through everything, through the years when the public had not wanted her, through the scrutiny, through the long, difficult road to a marriage the country had been slow to accept. He had chosen her, repeatedly, across decades of pressure that would have ended lesser commitments. And now his sister was sitting across from him, quietly, without malice, without drama, presenting him with documentation that made it impossible to pretend there was nothing to see. The room was very quiet. Charles read the dossier. He read it with the focus of a man who understood exactly what each page meant, not just personally but constitutionally. He understood that if the arrangement had been finalized, the damage would not have been limited to a financial irregularity. It would have been a wound to the integrity of the Crown's asset management, the kind of wound that does not heal quietly, the kind that eventually finds its way into public record and becomes a story the monarchy carries for generations. He could not allow it. The decision, according to those who would later speak carefully about what happened that night, came faster than anyone anticipated. There was no extended deliberation. There were no calls placed to legal advisors or senior courtiers for consultation. Charles did not take the dossier away to review it privately over several days, as he might have done with a less urgent matter. He made the decision in the room, in the presence of his sister, in the silence of that locked Sandringham study, with the weight of the institution pressing down on every second. He signed the counter-order. With that signature, absolute administrative oversight of the Sandringham estate moved formally and completely out of any arrangement Camilla had constructed and directly into Princess Anne's hands. The agricultural revenues, the estate management authority, the financial oversight, all of it, transferred, sealed, irreversible under the terms of the order itself. Everything Camilla had spent months building was gone in the space of a single document signed by the one person whose authority over the matter was absolute. And Camilla did not know it yet. That gap, the period between Charles signing the order and Camilla learning what had happened, was described by insiders as one of the most charged silences the palace had experienced in years. The night continued around the estate as though nothing had changed. The frost lay undisturbed across the grounds. The household remained quiet, and somewhere inside Sandringham, Queen Camilla slept, unaware that the architecture of everything she had carefully constructed had already been demolished by the time the darkness began lifting from the Norfolk sky. Morning came slowly, and with it, the kind of revelation that does not arrive with gentleness. When Camilla learned what had been signed, when the reality of the counterorder reached her through whatever channel delivered the news that morning, the response reportedly sent a visible tremor through the inner palace. Not a public display, nothing that would reach the press in any direct form. But those inside the household described the atmosphere in the hours that followed as something they had never experienced before in that building. Not grief, not simple anger. Something deeper and more complicated. The feeling of a person who has spent considerable time constructing something significant, who believed they had moved carefully enough to reach the finish line, discovering in a single morning that they had never been as invisible as they thought. Camilla had been seen, she had been documented, and she had been stopped. The palace divided almost immediately, not loudly, not in the way that produces public statements and visible confrontation. But insiders spoke of a fracture that settled into the household with the permanence of something structural rather than emotional. Courtiers who had operated in Camilla's orbit for years found themselves navigating new calculations. Senior aides reportedly grew careful with their words in a way that signaled an awareness that the balance of influence inside the building had shifted in a single night. Allegiances that had formed gradually over years were suddenly being quietly reconsidered in light of what had happened at that desk. William and Catherine were watching. Those close to the couple described their position in the aftermath as composed but clear. There was no public statement, no visible alignment expressed through dramatic gesture. But palace insiders whispered that both William and Catherine understood the significance of what and had done, and that their private support for the intervention was unambiguous. For William especially, the night at Sandringham carried a lesson about the monarchy that no formal briefing could have delivered as powerfully. The crown does not bend toward personal ambition. Corrects, and when it corrects, the correction is absolute. And herself said nothing publicly. That silence was noted, commented upon, interpreted in the way that royal silences always are, as a form of communication more precise than any statement. She had not acted for recognition. She had not walked into that study with the dossier because she wanted a title or a formal acknowledgement of what she had uncovered. She had acted because the institution demanded it of her and because she was, above every other definition anyone might apply to her, a woman who answered that demand without hesitation and without the need for applause. The crown had moved, quietly, completely, and in the direction it had always historically moved when threatened from within, toward protection, toward continuity, toward the people willing to defend it without flinching. Camilla's position inside the royal structure did not disappear overnight. She remained queen. She would continue to appear at public engagements, to stand beside Charles at the events the calendar demanded, to wear the title that decades of endurance had eventually delivered to her. But something had changed around her in a way that titles cannot reverse.
The trust that forms the invisible architecture of influence inside any institution, once fractured at that depth, does not simply rebuild itself because the outward appearances remain in place. She had been seen, and she had been stopped. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of Sandringham, beneath the weight of what had been signed and sealed and made permanent in the space of a single midnight hour, the monarchy had reminded everyone inside its walls of the truth it had always known and always enforced. The crown comes first. It has always come first. It will always come first. But here is what no one inside the palace is talking about publicly yet. What and uncovered at Sandringham was reportedly only the most visible layer of a far larger pattern. Sources close to the investigation whisper that the financial dossier contained references to arrangements extending well beyond the Norfolk estate, arrangements touching other crown properties, other revenue streams, other channels that had been quietly redirected over a longer period than anyone has yet confirmed. The Sandringham order may have been the blow that landed. But the full picture of what and found, and what Charles has not yet decided to do with the rest of it, is a story that is still unfolding behind doors the public cannot see. In the next video, that deeper layer surfaces, and the name attached to what comes next will genuinely shock you.